So let me welcome you all. I'm just delighted. We have a very wonderful mix of disciplines and imaginations and projects. And I'm going to be very brief. I'll talk more later. And I just wanted to introduce our conference. Richard Sennett and I have organized this. And one way of putting it is that we start from very, very different angles. Angles in terms of complex realities, etc., urban realities. But the aspiration is a bit to find that in-between space where these two very different visions, the global street and Theatrum Mundi, come together. Theatrum Mundi, with its long histories, recognized genealogies of imaginations, of art and culture. Global street, with its own histories and genealogies, but less recognized, rougher, less made, less identified, etc. So I'm just going to give you two thoughts on this concept, the global street, which I think of as a space for making for those who lack access to the formal instruments for making a built environment, for making a politics, for making a history, for making the social. And in that sense, it is difficult to track where does it happen, how does it happen. Clearly we have had very recent histories over the last few years, the last 2 years, which to me embody this notion of the global street, where masses of people can, especially this is the most extreme version certainly in Cairo, which is the imagined here situation, where masses of people unarmed can recode tanks which are coming to control, machines for destroying and for killing. That is the capacity of this mixture, if you want, of a multitude and urban space. The multitude alone could not do it, but urban space enables. And so how can we think of this as a variable? At one end, this very extreme condition, again, I think Cairo, and at the other end, micro versions of that, little versions. I would say, you know, urban farming in some of its elements, the initiative, the aspiration to make, the aspiration to intervene, anything that has to do with making a space that can also be a space for the political has elements of that. So the global street is really a variable, but it is above all a space for making, but by those who do not have access to those formal instruments. I mean, in my view, the city is also a space for making for those who have access to very formal instruments. I think finance, some of you know that I think that, finance has made a lot of stuff in the last 20 years. And the city has been a critical space. It was not just Washington's government, you know, when we speak about this. So making is also a variable. I'm just looking at one particular side of that. Richard, you want to quickly address Theatrum Mundi? There is more beauty and more reassurance in that subject.
Let me also welcome you all here to this foreign university, to many of the people here. And may I thank the staff of the Committee on Global Thought and Dom Bagnado from New York University for getting this conference together. I would say that the overall theme that we're going to explore today is the difference between presence and absence in the city. In our own minds, this difference lies physically. Who actually is on the street? And also perceptually. How are people aware of others, accounting or discounting their presence in urban space? In the course of the day, we want to account the roles of technology, trade, design, and politics in constructing both presence and absence. How do these various forces make us more aware of each other, put us in contact with each other, or withdraw us from the street? And finally, we want to pose some questions about how to arouse people to want more engagement with others rather than to retreat in isolation. So that is the kind of overall theme of the day, which is about how to bring the street to life and why the street became dead. I wanted to just say a word about Theatrum Mundi. It's a project that will go on for 3 or 4 years that's located in New York and London, and I think probably in Frankfurt and both Frankfurt and Berlin. And the idea of it is to bring people who do urban design together with people who work in the performing arts. And it's an old tradition that goes back to the Renaissance. The idea of it is that there's a relationship between the stage and the street that creates a certain kind of urban culture, a culture which is arousing. That there are things that designers can learn from the ways in which people are aroused in the theater, and there are things about the relationship between everyday publics and the work of professional theater makers that can help the theater makers understand better what they're doing. As it's evolving, this project is becoming more and more about urban culture and urban design tout court. But we started with people who are, if you like, specialists in working on the problem of how do you arouse the public, how do you get a group of people in the theater to work and to become aroused. So what you'll hear today are, at the end of the day, some rather specialized comments on that. But before that, you'll hear people who are doing new things in technology to make street life more lively. You hear about issues about trade and so on, that are all in a kind of broader sense urban culture. So our own project is evolving, as it should. You can go on to the website, which is Theatrum Mundi.org, and see what the projects we're presently involved in. So that's how we're going to spend the day. We hope you get something of real value from these presentations and discussions. We will be, we'll be frequently, we'll be around, so we'll have some informal things. I wanted to draw your attention as well to a workshop that TM is staging tomorrow afternoon, downtown, that's the proper end of New York, on designing spaces for free speech in New York City. And that's a workshop at the Maison Française that brings a number of people who have been involved in the Occupy movements and who have been involved in trying to animate crowd life, to think about a particular project, that, a kind of challenge that we're going to have in New York City about finding spaces and designing spaces for free speech in the city. So that's a workshop tomorrow afternoon. If you're interested in that, let any of us know, but particularly Don Bagnato. Can you raise your hand? Where are you? Here you. Here. So with that, why don't we sit? Our first panel is chaired by Michael Kimmelman of the Times and includes my colleague Richard Burdett and myself and Stephen Duncombe, who are going to talk about the state of the street. So that's where we'll begin. How about if we sit over here rather than...
associative rather than illustrative.
Could you pass the water down here? So, hi. I think it's my role to begin. I'm going to moderate this, and as such, I'll do a couple of minutes of throat clearing, and then turn it over to everyone else who will speak at greater length, and then we'll have a discussion and open it up, I guess, yeah? For questions. Since the late 1990s, the share of automobile miles driven by Americans in their 20s has fallen from 20.8% to 13.7%. The number of 19-year-olds opting out of driver's licenses has tripled since the 70s, from 8 to 23%. So we're a long way in this country from a culture that thinks cars are a luxury or superfluous, but a larger and larger portion of the population seems to be moving in that direction. We all know about the demographic shift among young people and empty nesters, as they're called here, that has resuscitated many downtown areas. The numbers may not be stupendous yet. Americans are still moving more of them to the suburbs than downtown. But the shift is real and noticeable in many places. Deindustrialization, plummeting crime rates, a growing number of singles and smaller families all contribute to the change. A key factor is retiring baby boomers, whose numbers will skyrocket in coming decades. Along with millennials, they're increasingly moving into cities because they want neighborhoods and walkable streets. If trends continue, of the 101 million new households that are expected to take shape between now and 2025, nearly 90% of them, I gather, are going to be childless. I don't know how they know this, but apparently this is the trend, meaning fewer families in any case looking for a good suburban high school and a backyard. More affluent people should be looking for urban amenities, for what you might call the theater of street life and the liberal anonymity of city living, as opposed to the quasi-privacy, but with intrusive regulations, of a gated suburb. But what is urban public space? It includes our streets, parks, and plazas, but who shapes and controls these places? One of the most enduring and powerful messages of the Occupy movement was the ambiguity of ownership. It became a common irony in discussions about Zuccotti Park that the site could legally be occupied only because it was, in fact, a private park. Public parks have hours and strict rules of behavior. Try getting a permit to stage a protest in Central Park or along Fifth Avenue, as opposed to a concert or a parade, and you'll soon learn about the rules and their limitations. But Zuccotti, which the city got only as a so-called bonus in return for giving Brookfield Properties the right to build an even taller office tower next to it, had no rules restricting hours. That's since been changed, by the way, as have the rules restricting use at countless other so-called privately owned public spaces, or POPs, which have been reconfigured post-Zuccotti to prevent future occupations. And I think it's interesting to talk about designing spaces, obviously, for public protest in future, whether that's even possible. The point is that Occupy revealed, even if only incidentally, just how much public space in New York is actually private property. And moreover, that we gained this space by making concessions to developers. The system turns out not to begin with how we wish to devise our streets and public spaces, and then moves on to finding commercial development that serves this end. It's the reverse. Zone for development and eke out what we can get for the public good. Sometimes this works. Often it doesn't, and I'm sure we'll talk about that this morning. Let's just say I think the best streets and spaces favor pedestrians and encourage diverse activities, and I agree very much with what Saskia was saying about streets being the spaces in which we stage not only political, but all other kind of social activities. I've often said to people, since I moved back home here from Berlin last year, that I'm struck by one big difference between Europe and America. In countries like Germany and France, there's an acceptance and focus on urban life and a social compact integral to citizenship, which takes for granted benefits like decent health care, infrastructure, transit, education, and so on. In America, we hardly talk about urbanism these days outside gatherings like this. It's not at all, as you know, part of the current political debate. And we increasingly depend on private interests to provide our services. But this morning, just to be perverse, let me flip the equation and just briefly end now by throwing out two examples that demonstrate to me the importance and creativity of street life as well as its frailty. From Europe, there's L'Aquila, the Italian city that, as you may recall, suffered a terrible earthquake in 2009. The entire historic center of town, which is fantastic, largely medieval and redesigned in the Baroque and early 20th century. It's a fantastic center, but it was damaged, shuttered, and it has remained closed ever since. The government, partly because of corruption, partly incompetence, partly because of a failure to recognize Italy's own great urban virtues, has hardly rebuilt any of it. And no resident has yet moved back in. I visited several times since the quake. I was there a day after and about 3 or 4 times since. It's now a tourist site, ruin porn. Really, people walk around the streets, empty streets, and look at the crumbled buildings, but nobody gets to live there. Meanwhile, Berlusconi's government and the builders he hired poured resources into creating so-called new towns. That's what he called them. Faceless housing projects with no amenities and transport, no life at all, on the fringes of the city in a kind of nowhere sprawl of highways that were said to be temporary homes for displaced L'Aquilans but have become permanent. They've become places essentially to dump the elderly and families who were cut off from what they knew as daily life. Daily life meant the life of the streets. It was so interesting to me that Italy failed, in this case, to recognize its own urban virtues because L'Aquila was its streets and squares, and without them, it's dying. I was glad to hear that Mario Monti, the Prime Minister, recently said the new towns were a bad idea and that L'Aquila needs to be reopened before it's too late. I hope it isn't already. Halfway around the globe in San Francisco, there's a project called Proxy, I just saw the other day. This is a 2-block temporary development on a place called Octavia Street. A firm called Envelope A+D, which is run by Douglas Burnham, an architect out there, responded to a request for proposals from the San Francisco mayor's office for temporary uses on the vacant lots left over by the removal of the 101 Central Freeway. The mayor's office, in turn, had been responding to requests from the neighborhood, which is called Hayes Valley. People in Hayes Valley wanted something done with the lots on their street. They wanted street life, so they took the initiative. It was ground up, like so much urban change these days. Some lots had already become urban farms of the sort Saskia mentioned. Envelope picked 2 underused sites along what's called Patricia's Green, which is a new park that arose where the freeway was, or had been, between Hayes and Fell Streets, a very lively spot. The idea has been to install a mix of art and commerce in shipping containers. So there's in it a very San Francisco sort of bespoke ice cream shop. Every ice cream is made with its own. Anyway, well, trust me. And also this very high-end local coffee shop. You know, you can't get a coffee in San Francisco without it taking like 20 minutes, and they have to explain what the beans are and where they come from. But anyway, one of those. Along with a beer garden, which is actually, I can say, as a quasi-Berliner, a pretty good beer garden. And there's going to be some galleries and some retail and public spaces that are going to open. They're shortly to come. So the project is temporary. All of it, as I said, is in containers so far, but rather smartly designed. And it's meant to reflect the urban and theatrical character of the neighborhood, which itself is rapidly evolving from a seedy part of town into one of the most fashionable. I think it's the sort of urbanism Jane Jacobs would have recognized, would recognize now half a century after Life and Death. And it seems to be proof of the vitality and democracy of street life, but also the urgency of its protection and cultivation. So with that, let me turn it over to Richard.
Well, just to have a slight change of point of view, I'm going to speak a little more. Does this work?
No.
Well, Well, in that case, can I borrow your microphone? It's very kind of you. But you can keep your water. I'd like to provide some historical background and of a more general sort about what we mean about street life. And the best place to do that is probably to think ourselves back a century to Potsdamer Platz in Berlin in 1910, 1912, something like that. It was a place that was very, very dense, and it had a lot of diversity on the street. And its greatest observer was Georg Simmel, who famously created the image of what he called the urban mask from this street. And that is, you're constantly being bombarded by sensations. The street is constantly giving you energy, and it's overstimulating you. And the mask is the ways in which you protect yourself against the presence of the street. You act in a very neutral fashion, you're very rational, but still you're constantly feeling with other people inside yourself. You're feeling their presence. Its presence as something that's almost too much in your experience of the city. And the mask that you don, which is of showing nothing to other people, does very little to the fact that you're constantly looking at the others, wondering what they're thinking, what they're doing, and so on. Another version of this notion of the overwhelming presence of the street comes from the writer Elias Canetti, whose book Crowds and Power I would recommend to you as really intelligent as well as historic document about everyday street life, as well as theoretically a really interesting book. Canetti also knew Potsdamer Platz, this stimulating thing, and he was scared of it for a different reason, for political rather than psychological reasons. He had an insight that this space would be on the street, a way for crowds to form and become violent, for people that would do something in a mass together that they wouldn't do individually. They'd be impersonal. You couldn't see what your neighbor, the person next to you in the crowd was not a neighbor, and so on. And so you could sort of let the monster in you out. And he explained, Canetti, and I think it's a pretty powerful explanation, that much of the energy for Nazism is street energy. It's there's too much street, there's too much presence. In his case, it takes this political channel, although it also has a psychological dimension, because he thought that people would, he's really the father of social psychology, that there's a whole different psychology of crowds than there is of individuals. But for both Simmel and Canetti, the street is too present, too alive. Now, a century later, we don't know streets like that. The street is understimulating. These are things that, these are descriptions of street life that don't make very much sense for us. There are many reasons for that. There's sort of dominance of traffic, conversion of multi-use into non-use streets for shopping and so on. But I think there's a more fundamental shift that has occurred. And that is that in Western cities, difference and indifference have combined. That is to say, even with the best will in the world, the planner who throws lots of different people, or in a city like Cairo, when you have lots of different people on the street, that the conditions of being different from someone else have evolved in such a fashion that you're really not stimulated by what makes them different from you. You don't recognize it. You don't see it. We're in contrast to a century ago. Our problem in the modern city is this combination of difference and indifference. Now, I think this is a property of modernity itself, and that's a very tempting rabbit hole I'm not going to go down. But to me, the problem is how we can therefore bring the street back to life without certainly bringing it back to life in the form that Canetti feared as a place for violence. But perhaps more in a way that Simmel imagined, a place where we're constantly alert, even though we might not show much to others, talk to strangers, for instance, where we're constantly noticing where we are. I guess a way to put this is that sort of in chemical terms today, we have in cities mixtures, but not compounds or reactions. So that's what I would like to see urbanism in our own time address. And I have three ideas about that. They won't do the trick, but they're at least ideas to put out for you and as designers, since we're in place here. What can urban design do about this kind of street dullness? And as I've thought about this over the years, I've thought about three things. One, it's almost self-evident to you that a street has two sides, or as people now put it, our colleague Enrique Zaropolo, a street has dual faciality. In design, we often look at a street, we look at one side of a street and what's happening, which is a kind of linear way of looking at the street, instead of a street as being two-sided. As I say, well, once I say this is obvious. But a lot of urban design is about the notion of the street as a one-faced liner, rather than this dual face going backwards and forwards. I've been very struck, if I may say so, in New York University's so-called Plan 2031, which is an attempt to expand the university, that this dual faciality doesn't exist at all. They look at one side of the street, but not what's across it. And thinking in those terms is a way to begin to see that there's more than a view here. There's an interaction across the street. The second thing I've thought about in order to bring streets back to life has to do with what I call sort of decontextual or disruptive insertions into centers. And I've been thinking about this, particularly in terms of shopping centers or shopping malls, which are monocultures. And these monocultures of one, chain store after the next, are a way that the streets become deadened. It's the same function over and over and over. And I first got interested in this problem when working on the problem of where to put an AIDS center in the suburbs. We put it in a smallish shopping mall in Rye, New York. Suddenly, the space came to life. People fought it with everything they knew you can imagine. An AIDS center here, all these terrible people, ill people. In the middle, all I want to do is buy a handbag, and I have to see all these people who are ill. But this kind of non-contextual, disruptive, and non-economic insertion of public service into the street seems to me a way to jolt people into beginning to notice where they are. And the third aspect of this, I would just say, what we as urban designers and planners can do about this dead street is to look at which streets we're looking at. Why do we put so much attention in New York City on streets right in the center, and so little attention on the condition of streets like 96th or Canal Street? The edges, we've tended in planning to focus all of our attention on doing something about the street, on streets right in the center of particular communities, rather the edges between different kind of communities, whether they be economic or ethnic. A place like Canal Street should be Main Street of a certain sort for New Yorkers, because it lies, or it has lied, at the center, at the edge between two very different kinds of communities. And I felt this when I lived in New York. I felt this about 96th Street as well. That it's a way, if we would concentrate resources there, if we would try and develop those streets, those peripheral streets, that at least what we could do is we could give people the experience of being in the presence of alien bodies. We are so addicted to comfort that the notion for a white person of going out for a bottle of milk into a black area, into a store that's mostly a bodega, or a store that's mostly serving blacks, is a slightly uncomfortable thing. And my notion about these streets at the edge is that they are ways at least of giving us that kind of physical stimulation of being in the presence of alien bodies, which more and more in modern cities people tend to shy away from. So that's my thought about the state of the street. It's very different than it was a century ago. A century ago, people thought the street was a threat. It was an overwhelming, overstimulating presence, or a channel for kind of political outpouring. Today, streets are, I would say, much lower intensity experiences in the city. They combine difference and indifference. The planner or the designer can't fix this problem visually or physically, but can do something to abet it. One of the ways is by thinking about the street not as a place to move through, but in this dual faciality idea of moving back and forward, of seeing a street as two sides which interact with each other. Not as a picture, but as a process. Secondly, I think planning and urban design can purposely be disruptive of context, of putting things that are inappropriate, particularly public services, public activities, into private spaces, as in our work up in Rye. And third, that we have to begin more to think about the streets that matter to us being the streets of, that are between economic, ethnic, or racial zones in the city. Those are the streets that we want to try to bring to life, rather than 42nd Street, 96th Street. And it's not necessarily going to make people more talkative, but having the presence of something that is an alien to your own physical experience, an alien body, is at least a kind of way of getting people to notice where they are. So I'd like to come back to Zimmel's proposition. I'd like to have the problem that Simmel had about how to protect yourself against overstimulation. And I think it's a problem that we can begin to plan for in modern cities. How can we plan to make cities overstimulating? That's where I'm at.
Let's see if this works.
Do you want us to?
No. I'm going to come back there, actually. I just want to start, sort of set the mood with something. Let's see. Let's see if this works. It's working on here, but alas, not up there. Yep. It looks lovely up here.
Ah,
there we go. Okay. Presents. Let me bring it to the next slide from up there. Absence. I was part of the occupation of Zuccotti Park, and what this means exactly I'll talk about later. And is it better for me here or up there? Tim? Okay. And I protested the shutdown of Zuccotti Park. But I also want to let you in on a sort of guilty secret. I was also very quietly happy to see it shut down. And amongst professional activists and organizers, I wasn't alone. What we were worried about by the end of November was that a tactic that is taking this park had become the goal, which is holding the park, and other goals were going by the wayside. And also that Zuccotti was becoming a de facto homeless shelter, and material resources were going into public services, food and bedding, medical care and policing, and human resources were going into the necessary difficulties of running a homeless shelter. And we were also excited by the promise of unleashing a cadre of activists into what we called real organizing. We were correct about the cadre of activists. Occupy protesters have gone on to do creative and sustained work around the country, stopping foreclosures, protesting student debt, and drawing attention to the predatory practices of banks. But the impact of these activists in terms of making their concerns known to a wider public and generating a wider social movement and bringing around demonstrable social change is relatively negligible. And I'm not too surprised. I travel around the country training activists, and every place I go, I'm actually amazed at how many activists there are, and how good they are, and how creative they are, and how committed they are. They've worked quietly for years, day after day, doing these very same things, and by and large, they're invisible. They have no presence. Now there's 200 or 300 or 400 more of them, but still, their presence is negligible. Not for the first time in my life, I was wrong. I was dead wrong about Occupy. It wasn't the people and the politics, it was the space that mattered as much as anything else. And what I want to talk about very briefly is how space mattered for Occupy. And I want to start by talking about, but actually detail 5 different ways that I think space and place were absolutely critical for understanding Occupy. I want to talk about solidarity, seizure, stage, spectacle, and finally street. So we'll start with, the first are not that surprising. I think the last working with this bunch of people that we have here has got me to think about the street in a different way. And I think it is a very useful way to think about protest. It's also the most speculative. Anyway, so let's start with solidarity. Solidarity is a sort of, the catchphrase for any sort of political movement. But what I think was interesting for Occupy, it wasn't necessarily solidarity in a shared purpose, goals, or party membership, but the proximity of bodies in shared space. It was visual, it was auditory, it was olfactory, sense of togetherness. Within Zuccotti Park, one was reminded constantly that you were part of a social movement. Solidarity was not an abstract ideal, therefore, but a visceral experience. Quite literally, I like to think of it as olfactory solidarity. In other words, it smelled, okay? And you were aware of that presence. It smelled differently than the streets around, sometimes not for the best. The second thing I want to talk about is seizure. Now, probably appropriation is a better term, but keeping with my mnemonic device of S terms, I'm going to use seizure. That is, Zuccotti Park wasn't just a space. It was a liberated place, okay? And the action of transforming what was a privately owned public space designed for and primarily used by financial workers on their lunch break, and its transformation into something else. That act of transformation was one of the things that gave that space meaning. Its seizure and use for the purposes that run counter to its original intent transformed it, therefore, into a radical public place. That is, we weren't just occupying space, but we were opening up space. And this is a distinction my friend Larry Bogad, who is going to be speaking in the brainstorm tomorrow, makes about protest spaces. You can occupy space, but also occupations can open up space in a way to look at those spaces differently. As he says, it disrupts the hegemonologue of single-use space. Zuccotti served as a spatial reminder for the people that were present that they were in rebellion, because it was a seized space, because it was ringed by the police. Third, the idea of stage. The slogan of the anti-capitalist globalization movement a decade previous, which was kind of a predecessor to the Occupy movement, was "Another world is possible." But the form of protests that globalization movement took, shutting down streets and day-long mass protests, did very little to demonstrate what that other world might look like. It was a negation. Occupy, however, as a space, provided a stage to demonstrate exactly what another world could look like. And there's very particular oddities about all of the occupies. Not only do the things that we think of when we think of Occupy, the General Assemblies, okay, this is what democracy looks like, but the libraries, the barbers, the religious services, including a sukkah in Zuccotti Park, classes, and unfortunately drum circles. These were things that essentially, as a stage, one could act out what this alternative world might look like. A world, essentially, that was based on generosity and solidarity rather than greed and individualism. Make no mistake, the function these served were not real in a material sense, but they did serve in a symbolic sense. That is, General Assemblies were notoriously inefficient. If anybody sat through one, they're just interminable. And the libraries, nobody ever returned the books. So they didn't work in the way that they were supposed to work, but they worked on a symbolic level of suggesting sort of a counter-society, okay? And very interestingly, a counter-society with its roots deep in democracy, the idea of public libraries, the idea of small-scale town meetings, and so on and so forth. It's what social movement theorists like Barbara Epstein calls prefigurative politics. But because it was a space, it also serves as a stage where this could happen every single day. Leads to the fourth idea, which is spectacle. The space of Occupy created a convenient place for the media to find a story. That is, one of the problems with doing protest work and activist work is you're always trying to get the media to cover your story. And journalists, present company accepted, are, let's say they're overtaxed. That's the polite way to say it. And they don't have time to follow you around, okay? This was a convenient place where the media could actually go down and get a story at any time they needed a story. And because it functioned as a stage, it provided the visuals in the performance which could communicate the message in a soundbite or a short video clip. That is, you show a picture of a General Assembly, and voila, this is what democracy looks like. You show the splayed out multitude of signs and messages, voila, this is what plurality looks like. The final S, however, is I think the most interesting thing to think about, and the thing I've been thinking about the most and also the most recently. Particularly for here at this conference, I think it's interesting to think about, which is Occupy happened in a space, but the place it resembled the most wasn't a bounded square or a political rally, but instead a street. As a street, Occupy was porous. Richard was just talking about the edges being more important than the center. The edges of Occupy were far more interesting than the center of Occupy. The edges were places where people walked in and walked out, where people had had conversations, where tourists would come and wander their way through, where workers would stop by in their lunch hour, where students would arrive with their teachers, and the curious would stop by for a few hours. There was drop-ins and drop-outs. And the idea of this being a porous space meant that you could have an ebb and flow through the space. The center remained the same, but all around the periphery was this constant motion and movement and the recreation of what Occupy was in terms of who was there at any given moment. Like a street, Occupy was also asynchronous. There was little event time happening within Occupy, other than the daily General Assemblies. As a street has rhythms but is always open, Occupy was always open. And so any time spent in the place immediately became protest time. That is, it wasn't like a rally where you have to show up at a given time and you go home at a given time. And if you didn't make it, well, you weren't part of that rally. This provided a place, Occupy, in which you could become a protester at any moment by entering into this space. And then leave it as well. Follows the next, which is, like a street, it was open. There was no cost to admission, no membership to join, no platform to sign on to. Anybody could be and was part of Occupy merely by showing up and entering this place. I started by saying I was part of Occupy. I was part of Occupy because I went to Occupy, because I protested at Occupy. I also left Occupy. And some days I didn't go. Some weeks I didn't go. And then I would spend time there and I would leave. But I became part of Occupy because anybody who showed up was part of Occupy. Also, like a street, a place of difference. Not as much as it could be. The majority of people at Occupy were young and white, but no means exclusively so. There's many more older people, people of color, poor people, people wearing suits or tweed, than the usual protest. Yes, there was lots of people in Carhartt jeans and dreadlocks, given, but there was also a startling heterogeneity for that type of a protest. It was also multivocal. The plurality of message expressed in the multi-use of signs created and carried by the occupiers, the refusal to put forth a platform of demands, which was much maligned by mainstream commentators, but it meant that Occupy was a place for conversations rather than assertions. It was not a place for speechifying. In fact, the whole idea of the people's microphone kept speechifying to a minimum. What it was a place that you entered into and you talked to people. You met them. You said what you were doing here, or you listened to someone, but not for long extended periods of time. You couldn't dominate the space in that way. Getting close, I think, to the definition of politics, the idea of discussion and debate, contesting and conversation put forth by people like Rancière, for example. And finally, this idea of multifunctionality. The street, of course, is not owned by anyone, and unlike a road or a highway, it's not designed for a singular use. Richard had been talking about this sort of multi-faciality of streets. A street, unlike a road, is a place for driving, but it's also for strolling, for shopping, for living, for conversations, for sitting, for smoking, ideally for drinking. Similarly, one went to Occupy not just to protest, but to see friends, to gawk at freaks, to take part in the meetings, to have a discussion, to sit down, or even, unfortunately, to play in a drum circle. You can tell how I feel about drum circles. The sum total of these qualities was the thing we know as Occupy, but I want to point out, or try to make us think about Occupy not as a thing, but as a street, as a place of fluidity, of motion, of purpose, and of time that gave Occupy its special and attractive quality. As Saskia defined the street, it was a place of making, okay? It was a place where things happened, and this is what defined the street. Now, alas, hindsight is cheap. By the end of the occupation, countervailing tendencies, more traditional understandings of protest space were beginning to dominate. There was a firming up of boundaries between us and them, not just the us versus the police, but also internally. Are you really part of Occupy? How many meetings have you gone to? How many nights have you camped out? There was also a confusing of the symbolic with the material function of a lot of the things like libraries and general assemblies and so on, and a privileging of earnest authenticity over the play of performance. And finally, an overarching concern, aided by the state, with holding on to a particular space as opposed to seeing the place that had been created in Occupy. And because of this, opportunities were lost. At one time, Occupy Wall Street had taken in $800,000 in trackable donations, the bulk of which was spent on food and shelter. An office was opened in a building nearby, and all this was understandable. It was all done democratically, and it made sense at the time. But what one wonders what would have happened if Occupy had realized the centrality of space and the particularities of the place that had been created, and had spent that $800,000 on leasing a parking lot and opening it up to the ebb and flow of people. Protest and politics that characterized Zuccotti Park for those few months in the autumn of 2011. Thanks.
Can we have the next set of slides, please? Stephen, is this yours? Yours, okay. No, point taken. Well, Richard started with his cultural home, Berlin. I start in the 19th century. I start with my real home, Rome, with a map drawn by Giambattista Nolli, very familiar to many people in this room, really to respond to Saskia and Richard's brief in talking about the presence and absence of the street very much at a spatial level. We've heard two very different sort of cultural perspectives and social perspectives. And I want to bring it down to the level of literally the spatial dynamics of the street, but also add a social dimension myself by talking about the ethnography of an ordinary street, by making reference to some recent work we're doing together with Richard and other colleagues at the LSE. Now, I start with this image, familiar though it is to probably everyone in the room, to just remind us of one thing, that the person who drew this map in the 1750s, Giambattista Nolli, in drawing it, showing all the streets and alleyways and open spaces in white, and all the built form in black, very significantly kept all those interstitial spaces which are normally open for most of the time, exactly I think what Richard was capturing before, such as the interior of a church, the interior of the Pantheon, which you see here, as very much part of the mental map of what a city space is like. So I think the one point, obvious point I want to make, that in talking about streets, just as Richard was saying before, that there's a tendency even amongst designers to perhaps narrow it down to designing one side of the street. I think there's a tendency to isolate the street as if it exists on its own. It's always part of a very complex topographic and social and cultural model, which is really what I think we're talking about. And the street par excellence is a bit of a sort of obvious image, is the Barcelona Ramblas, but it has many dimensions that are just worth capturing as before I go into a sort of more detailed description. First of all, this street, which is, yes, has become a sort of tourist place, but is still the home to people who live left and right of this particular avenue, thoroughfare, is animated very much, as Richard sort of described, on both edges. Often I find myself, after Richard has spoken, basically illustrating with slides what he was saying. So I'm happily doing that once again. But you notice that literally every 3 or 4 meters, there is something happening on the street edge. So that visual sort of sensation is reinforced by this. But very importantly, it's also a street that takes you from the coast, from the port, all the way into sort of the central fabric of this extraordinary city. So the street functions obviously at different levels, both at the level of how it fits into the metropolitan, the global dimension, of course, that Saskia has talked about already, but it also functions very much at the sensory level of the physicality of what happens on the immediate edges. The fact that the trees that you can see here play a role in creating a canopy, creating a sort of a shelter, in many ways are as important as the buildings themselves. And when you then see how the medieval fabric of Barcelona was extended in the 1850s by Ildefonso Cerdà, you see how many of these notions of the street have just simply been magnified but continued. So again, I would contend, Richard, that this is the 19th century street, which continues to work well, albeit at a very, very different scale. It has those qualities of two-sidedness. In fact, at every street corner, that two-sidedness is multiplied into eight-sidedness because every building is cut back. And you have a square with many other things actually happening on each side. So these very, very spatial geometric design methodologies, I think, are very much part of the experience of the street, something that you know extremely well here in the exceptional exhibition I found earlier this year of the history of the New York grid, which taught me so much that there are different ways of coming up with geometries, some to do with money and some to do with form. And in this city, it's very clear what that's about. Richard has described the absence of the street in many ways in contemporary urbanism, focusing, I have to say, very much, it seems to be, on what we might call the global north, or certainly a Western experience of what is actually happening. It would be very difficult to actually take some of the ideas that Richard was describing and make them resonate with contemporary Mumbai or Dhaka today, and I think we may want to talk about that. But far more significantly, and it may much more of a concern, the way planners, architects, and politicians are intervening in the urban fabric of those very cities is like this. Now, these are places that we know allow people to have more space, more light, more fridges, more modcoms. What it isn't is a street, for sure. This will never be a street. This will never have the multiple scales that we were talking about. And there's such simple elements of what makes a street that, again, to an audience like this, it may be obvious, but may be worth just re-stressing when we talk about what is the presence and what is the absence of a street. In other words, what do you do not to have a street, which Richard has talked about. Generally, I want to talk about in a very simple way. This is East London Street from the 1800s. This happens to be a new project on the right-hand side, where certain elements of the relationship, a front door, a railing, a window overlooking the space, are completely understood, and very important regulating mechanisms which have a sort of psychological and social dimension. Here's another street, and it's leading to the world that Richard, in his number two scenario, dislikes, the world of the shopping mall. Now, this is a new street built in Stratford, in East London, one of the poorest areas of London, where the Olympics were held last summer, as many of you may have heard. And it's a street that actually links you from a major transport hub, I mean, not unlike Times Square in terms of its intensity, to a shopping center, which is that world. And that's the street. There's absolutely nothing left and right, because they wait for you to sort of capture you in there. And interestingly, thinking of Michael's introduction about L'Aquila in Italy and the fact that new towns are being built instead of the reinvigoration of the center, Holland provides enormously interesting models to all of us of how to actually make city. But I have to say that there, and we've been studying this recently, the new towns which have created, this is Almere, has 250, 300,000 people, seems to have lost all capacity to make rules and make city. These are two streets about 300 meters away, one in a new development in Eiburg in Amsterdam, and one in Almere, this new town. This does exactly what Richard was saying. It's a one-sided street. There's only stuff happening here, which happens to be a mobile phone company, and zero happening on the other side. It's actually more or less a blank wall. And there's sort of no one there, and there's no reason to actually be there. While the street on the right, I think, has the sort of potential that we're talking about. And one could go on in terms of the absence of street. This is how not to make street, and what most people, including at the architecture school at Columbia, I am sure, begin to train and think in their minds as what the architecture of the environment should be. Some nice buildings, some ugly buildings, some great concentration into unnecessary flower pots, but what you don't have, for sure, is a sense of street which creates that sort of stimulation. I was fascinated traveling there just a few weeks ago to Almere that they've created a zone which is basically do whatever you want. You can build, there's no regulation, self-build housing. It's the Dutch response to the housing crisis. And look what they're doing. In these buildings, they're creating streets. It's sort of the natural process of this without any regulation, which I think is fascinating. And there are other aspects that we don't have time to go in here, which is while the street in many ways can be seen as the place of togetherness, has been described so positively, it's also the space of fear, can be the space of fear. Johannesburg, Cape Town, many other African cities, the downtowns, the centers of Caracas, of Sao Paulo, Mexico City, have become places that people want to go away from, and are creating, in fact, streets or cities divided by walls, where what you see here is that, once you have a street which has got that as an edge, unfortunately, my caption covers the main point, which is unfortunate, but basically, the pavement is no longer used. No one's ever going to walk on these streets, and therefore the city doesn't put any more money into making pavements. So it's a sort of cycle, a negative cycle of what actually happens. Let me conclude, as I was saying, by talking about this one case study that perhaps brings back some of these issues about the presence and absence of streets in a more positive way. Slightly more positive, perhaps, than what Richard was concluding, that all planning, perhaps, is leading to a very negative, very dull scenario of the contemporary, certainly Western city. And of course, probably the reason this has happened is because there is no planning here. They've forgotten about the city. It's an abandoned part of South London. It's a poor part of South London, but culturally and economically and ethnically incredibly global, incredibly lively. In fact, just to say it now, if you look at this picture, you're at the heart of an area. You're not on a street. You're heart of an area which employs something like 12,000 people and has a turnover which is larger than that shopping center in Stratford. So there are different ways of describing this, but we decided to look at it at LS Cities in this very much reflecting sort of the paradigm that shapes our research of linking the visual with the social at 3 different scales and in a number of different ways. We importantly started looking not just at the street as an outside element, as a network of spaces at the level that I've already intimated, but also what happens in those 2 or 3 meters or 5 meters or 6 meters from that edge inwards. Because I think much of the research, much of the work that has been done by colleagues in this field ends at the street, but doesn't go into the building. And I think without, clearly that was your point, Richard, I think, without actually thinking what happens, how you animate that edge in terms of what happens behind, you can not really miss an important trick in understanding the dynamics of street life. So we looked at it in many ways, this particular street, at 3 different levels. We looked at it, here is the street itself. I'll show you a scale comparison in a moment. We looked at it as an integral part of this mechanism of space, very much using the Nolli plan of Rome as a dynamic. You can just see similarities in many ways. You don't have the Pantheon and some of the most beautiful 17th century churches in the world. But you have messy, grotty South London, which works. And this street works incredibly well and has survived the recent crisis in ways that were completely unexpected. We've looked at it at this scale. We've looked at it at the scale of what's happening inside the shop and actually interviewing a number of the people who work there and literally mapping out what happens on and inside these different elements. Just to remind ourselves, we look at some of the pictures, what happens that within each of these shops you have the antithesis of Richard's sort of negative conclusions of the shopping center, because in each one of these units, which may be as distant from me to where Richard is now sitting, you have 7 or 8 different shops. At the front, or activities. At the front, you have someone doing nails. 2 meters on, you have someone actually selling fruit from Afghanistan. 4 meters on, you have something else. And at the end, you have Western Union, all within one unit, employing some of the highest economic densities that exist in London. So those 2 worlds of that density of sort of economic activity and cultural exchange spill out onto the street. So these are the issues that, in a way, we've looked at, and I don't want to go into this in too much detail now, but I think it's important in looking at a street to look at the sort of ethical and cultural dimensions, the diversity that has been referred to before. The fact that they're very, very different in different parts of cities is incredibly significant. But that they're stretched mechanisms. I think that's an interesting idea, that it's not just a local thing, but it's very much tied into the global dimension that Saskia was referring to before. And as I've intimated, we're looking at it at 3 different scales. So let's quickly look in the last few minutes at these different scales and how they operate. This is a sort of map of the south side of London beneath the River Thames, so what one might refer to as central London is up there, Canary Wharf and the Olympics up there. This is sort of part of London which is difficult to imagine in the mental map of our experience of this city. And the street that I'm talking about is down there. Just to compare it in size, again, you referred to Canal Street. That's the sort of length that we're talking about, Fulton Mall, more familiar, or parts of Fifth Avenue, just to get a sense of the scale. The dynamic on the street and its edges is very, very varied, changes completely at different times of day, and over the years has had different layers of different migrants actually find a way of working and succeeding in terms of what happens. 2 or 3 maps of what the general area is like. This just shows you the different ethnicities. We're down here, one of the most ethnically diverse areas. This shows the deprivation, again, one of the poorest and more complex areas. You know, you can buy a meal at a supermarket or on the street for roughly the same amount of money. That's who it's addressing itself to. This is one of a myriad of 462 high streets in London, which many have thought have been going downhill, but actually the more work that has been done, the more one understands that it's their globalness, so to speak, which is actually the reason that they're thriving. There are 20, 30, 40 different nations which occupy the different facades and activities that you know there. Something very familiar to you in New York, but not so familiar elsewhere in the world. And because of time, we can't go through this in terms of nationalities, but we were struck, just looking at it in detail, that if we compare the number of people on Rye Lane compared to the staff at the LSE, more people speak more languages on this street than amongst LSE experts, and we thought we were global, but we're not. So, second scale is the scale of the neighborhood. That is, I think, Richard, your point about edges is really picked up by this. First of all, in terms of the economy, I was telling you a moment ago that there are more people and there's more turnover actually generated by this bit of London than by a major shopping center that we saw before. How this street actually fits into a series of cultural institutions, warehousing, and other activities is absolutely central. And the porosity and access to it is fundamental to success. Hence, again, relooking at this scale. And then thirdly, as we move into the other dimension, is trying to understand what is happening behind the street, as I've said, in terms of the depths of the units, in terms of the energy, so to speak, of activity behind it. And we don't need to go through this into detail, but you can just see from the headings here the range of different activities, from sort of beauty to money transactions to other sort of services, mobile telephone companies and food, which occupy this sort of narrow stretch of London. And I want to end by just talking about what we found in terms of the internal dynamics of this space. This could, you know, pick up many of the experiences of parts of the big avenues in New York, and goes against the sort of the dullness that we were talking about. This is very much to do with the vivacity and the integration. So we actually mapped, by going very closely and talking to people, we mapped the different activities and fascinating to see, even though we're not talking about it today, where different activities like clothes, nail varnishing and everything else are located. Money is always way at the back, because that's where you've got to go anyway, so you don't need a sort of front door to show that. And these are just some of the images which give you a sense of what happens near the street, and you go further back in, clothes, materials, food, all together. So let me conclude what our early thoughts are on this particular project. We found that these sorts of streets, these ordinary streets, these sort of banal streets which we think have nothing about them, are really litmus strips. They test what is happening both in the economy of the city and highly sensitive to change. So as the recession hit London, actually this area went up rather than down, because it's much more easy to do business. And I think that's an interesting point. So improvisation and sort of duration of activities is very, very significant there. People don't stay there for 3 or 4 years, they stay there for 6 or 7 months and then move on. One needs to think about, just in terms of a research project, other ways of actually measuring value in city. And I think this is part of this major sort of project of Theatrum Mundi and the Global Street are about. We recognize through this particular analysis the cultural economy of this street is not only very pragmatic, but highly networked to the sort of links that we saw there, that clearly it operates at different scales, and that it's an essence of both spatial and social transactions which work together, very, very closely together, are not separate. So in that sense, maybe, since Saskia and Richard asked us to address this, yeah, maybe Jane Jacobs was right, that these two are intricately connected. So this is a story, a methodology, a series of considerations which apply to this street. And I want to end with this only because I think the conversation in this room, given the challenge, and I know other speakers are going to be talking about this later, is not just about the comfort of New York and London with its relative differences, but you know, what happens in a place like Caracas, not just on the right, or what is interpreted as a street, basically a motorway to get you from A to B, but what is actually happening here on the left-hand side, which is really where most of the sort of urbanism is going to happen, particularly in the informal sector over the next decades. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, there we go. Well, that certainly roamed around quite a bit, so we have lots to do and lots to talk about and lots to unpack. And I'm just going to say a couple of things myself, and then I wanted to just ask a couple of questions. I was thinking, Stephen, about your remark about the street as opposed to the square. And, of course, when I went to Occupy the first time, the sense of creating this kind of polis, this model city, was so interesting to me. But I think, and this is, I don't want to dwell on this, but I think one of the interesting things about the shape of Occupy in Zuccotti, and I gather that this was a not uncommon feature of other occupations, was that they chose spaces that were confined, actually stage-like, like a theater in the round, which was very important for many of the functions you described, and is not exactly a street, but is really a square, a piazza. In fact, it was very crucial to creating a kind of urban density so that you could have 200 people sleeping there and create the impression that this was a large group. Had the same group in meeting in the middle of, you know, Sheep's Meadow or something like this, it would have occupied a tiny corner and been irrelevant. And this addresses something of a very interesting question about renting space in a parking lot, which is quite interesting, but opens onto another question related to that, which is to what extent is the, you might say, the legal occupation or rental of a space undoing the thing itself. But I want to leave that aside for a second to say that maybe we should turn first to, since we've talked about different kinds of spaces, and Rick, you mentioned this very clearly, the unpacking bit has to separate out the global south and most of the growth of cities which are taking place in informal settlements overwhelmingly. from what you were addressing, Richard, which was more really a kind of a global north problem. And so I want to challenge a question you raise in relation to Berlin or New York or London. Do you feel really that there is? See, I'll answer it with a.
You're answering your own.
I'm answering a question, so I'll let you. Yeah, I was struck. Let's put it this way, by your idea that there is this problem with edges or diversity. I actually think that maybe this is I don't know, this is just a changing attitude towards cities, but I think that to the extent that people are moving back to cities, especially young people, but not just young people, it is precisely because they're looking for diverse, complex places, the high streets, the racially mixed places, and you see that all throughout a city like New York, and I think in London as well. When you said that there's a growth of these high streets and that you know, they're becoming more diverse, that actually makes perfectly good sense to me. I mean, I think, to me, this question you're asking has to do with a large number of, let's say, American cities of a different scale.
But, you know, I'd say about that, the problem is that we're exporting ideas about how to design places, and we're, that this Western developed dichotomy, I'm a little worried about it.
Is this working?
Can you hear him?
Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry.
When we were, our shop went to Mumbai a few years ago, all the planners really wanted to build Chicago in Mumbai. It's very hard to get somebody, they think it's patronizing, and they may be right, to say, oh, so much local color, you know. Let's just leave it the way it is, it's so on. But the problem is that the idea of the developed that's imported is often very dead. And my worry about all of what's happening in urban design now is that the cities that we're making, that are being made in Latin America, China, and India, are sort of the best case or the best practice things are in fact the worst practice, you know? Nobody could go to Songdo in South Korea, which is a kind of technopolis heaven in a way, and think, I want to live here. And yet it's the most advanced Western thing. In other words, I think what we're doing is exporting ways of neutralizing the city. And we oppose that to sort of native color. And that's it's a terrible trap. I don't know if you agree with this.
Well, that image I showed on the edge of Shanghai is an image that really we could, any of the cities you've just mentioned or others, illustrate exactly that process of change. So I agree one shouldn't be romantic, let's say, about the high streets of Mumbai or Lagos. On the other hand, I think for the next 30, 40 years, those arteries in the cities that we're talking about will remain, particularly in the poorer countries where there isn't money to create the sort of environments that you've just described. I think one of the things we do need to perhaps though refine even the tools of inquiry, because, and this is where the work of people like Raul Marotra at the Graduate School of Design is, I think, very helpful here, in talking about the kinetic city, how the spaces of the city, whether it's a street or a square, are used in very, very different ways at different times of day. And that's not the 24-hour city, it's just a much more complex and rich place where space is scarce, and I think that's an important dimension of this discussion. Not everywhere can we afford space. Where space is scarce, we therefore need to use it, maybe for a wedding, for a place of transaction or for a cricket game, all within, you know, the space of maybe 18 hours or different times of year. It varies. And I think that is something that perhaps we're beginning to rediscover. Unfortunately, many of the environments you're talking about, let's say, with your statistics, which I'd never heard and very, very interesting about the American retrofitting or coming back into cities, which is intriguing. I suspect that's partly true in parts of the UK, but not in most of Europe, in fact. I think what is happening is that that activity, which is a sort of a pull factor, tends to be cappuccinos.
Right. I mean, is right. Although cappuccinos,
the power of cappuccino.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, and therefore it's a very thin way of, I think, addressing some of these issues.
Yes, it's true. Although, of course, you know, when you talk about diversity of people, and now you're also talking about, which I agree with, completely diversity of activities and ambiguity of spaces, that is, spaces that can be used in multiple ways. I mean, the idea that people come together and have a coffee is a powerful thing. At Occupy, the center of this quasi-town was, in fact, the food area. People gathered around it. But I think this is an interesting question. How does one design plan that is for ambiguity and ambivalence? It's very useful in the sense of political space too, I think, because if you plan for political space, you are, you know, quarantining it, as it were. But if you don't allow for it, then you're creating restrictive spaces. So what does it mean, really, to create ambiguous spaces? It has a little to do, I think, Richard, with what you're suggesting about edges or the implications of edges. How does one begin to think about constructive ambiguity as a planner or an architect?
Or as an activist.
Well, I mean, this is the question we've been talking
doing
about. This is the question we've been talking about for a year or so now, which is particularly in our interest of sort of creating spaces for free speech, while also acknowledging that those places for free speech which are most creative have often been seized, have often been appropriated, have had its previous use turned on its head and become something else. And so the question always is well, how can we actually plan for that? Can we plan for seizure, actually, is one way of looking at it. But the other way is, as you pointed out, Michael, is that there are spaces which are planned to deaden that. I don't think you can ever create a space and say, this will be a vibrant space, and this will be a place of free speech and free culture. But I think you can plan a space, as some of the spaces that we've been seeing here, where you're dead assured that it's not going to happen. And so maybe it's just sort of setting the conditions for people to create those spaces, make those places themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned Proxy, which was somewhat of a boutique example of this, but the reason, partly I mentioned it because I was just there last week, but also because there was this way in which you had empty lots in a changing neighborhood and people themselves take an initiative. It's a high-end version of exactly what you're talking here. This ability, I think, to create spaces where people take the initiative to create their own variety out of, you know, whether it's a street or a square or a series of streets and squares. This is difficult, obviously, to plan for. You need to create both social and economic conditions for it. In New York, for instance, I mean, we zone, but we don't plan, which is quite interesting. And this is what I was implying earlier by saying we wait for private developers to take an initiative.
I mean, I think there's also the issue about this, that if we don't plan, I'm a little worried about the Jane Jacobs thing. She thought these things just happened spontaneously. Right. Give them a space and they will come and do it. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think, and this is cultural reasons for this, that the notion of a kind of spontaneous stimulation of other people won't happen. And therefore, something has to be designed. You could call it political action, it could be urban design, but there's something that has to want people who usually just want to go about their business, they want to smoke, drink, etc., to say, I'm actually going to spend some time doing something that is neither shopping nor working, nor hanging out, but that has more of a point. And this is something about Jane Jacobs that always, although I adored her, and I think it's a wonderful book in some ways, the notion that life is just there, waiting to be released. And if only we, urbanists, would get out of the way, you know, people overflow with life and so on. It's not true. You know, they're not overflowing. You have to stimulate. That's our problem now, which wasn't what it looked like to Zimmel. And that's what the workshop for this challenge to we're going to mount in New York for finding spaces and designing them for political speech is all about.
Let me just ask about the architecture of the streets. So I was living in Berlin for a little while, about a block from the Kudamm. And I grew up on 6th Avenue downtown, which when it was just, well, as you know, it's the loudest possible place you could be, just down the village, near Houston. And so I grew up sort of interested in how streets are attractive or not. I think it's just a natural thing when you live in a city. You just know that one street is somehow a place you want to be around and not another. And I came to feel about the Kudamm that there was something very interesting about it, because I had an office off Kantstrasse, so several blocks away. The Kudamm, as you may or may not know, is a wide commercial avenue, kind of West Berlin's response to Friedrichstrasse, and it's multi-lanes in both directions with a very large median, and then retail on both sides with mid-rise buildings, mostly 19th, early 20th century buildings of a Parisian sort, that is to say, a fairly Haussmann-like standard appearance. It really works incredibly well. Kantstrasse, a multi-lane street with a wide median, retail and mid-rise buildings, does not work well. It's a dead street. There is, and I think this is my long-winded way of answering your question, Richard, that it doesn't happen spontaneously, that there are streets which work better and don't, and that has to do to some extent with an architect and a planner's ability to understand the minutiae of, and we know that people have looked at this, but I still myself, I'm not entirely clear about what that mix is, what those proportions are, why some places are places you want to go and some places that can seem ostensibly the same simply are not.
Well, I think obviously it would be incredibly naive for any of us to try and answer that question. But also I think it's partly the wrong question, in the sense that it's not just the width and the section of the street. I think one of the things that the more work we do in this field, the more one realizes that its location within a bigger network is actually very, very important. So I don't know the two particular streets you're talking about as well as you do, but I'm sure their connectivity to a wider network of streets, alleyways, and is very, very different, and that will certainly account for what one might call the sort of the global connectivity or non. I think that is a significant element. The other part, which I think I was beginning to talk about, is what happens from the facade in, and particularly at the ground level. And literally the nature of the space. If we have a space which is 10 meters deep, 30 feet deep, and you can have 15 activities in them, that generates in and of itself a sort of local microeconomy which spills out onto the dynamic of the interface and the transactions that happen there. So I think there are multiple levels, and it's, much as we would like to say that the ideal section is the width is the same as the height in Paris, Berlin, or whatever. I think it's far more complicated than that. And so not to defend my rather trite comment about Jane Jacobs, all I was saying is that, well, in schools of architecture and the training of urban designers, that simple notion that Jane Jacobs came up with, there is a connection between built form and the way a space works, right? And how it affects people, is something, unfortunately, I'd say 95% of schools of architectural training in Mumbai, New York, London, and Paris is still not sort of bought into. So that was where I was going with that sort of comment, as opposed to saying, in fact, I was arguing that there are certain basic rules, some of which we've just discussed, about interfaces, about porosity, about connections, which I think she was getting at, which are just not used. That's all I was saying.
Can I make a final comment?
And then you're done, that's it?
Is that, what's our time? No? We're okay. If you thought about, so we were talking about this the other day, what do we mean by built form in this? If you thought about these issues about simulating people in the street, you might think about the old-fashioned long table in a cafe or in a pub or in a bar, which at one point in its history was meant to be, if you sat at a table twice this length, you sat down with a stranger, you had a mug of beer, and he or she had a right to talk to you. It's an epic, the cafe table that only holds one or two people is, to me, an epical event in the history of urbanism. Because now you can go into a place and be quiet and be silent. Nobody's going to come over to your table and say, well, not usually, would come over and say, you look very interesting. I'd like to sit down and talk to you. We've created enormous, and they're built forms. They're not architectural exactly, but they're physical forms for prohibiting sociability and prohibiting liveliness in public spaces, streets. A person in an 18th century cafe in Paris wouldn't recognize the Haussmann cafe as being a public space, because you could go in, order a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or your absinthe, thrilling, and sit with your absinthe for an hour, and nobody would talk to you. And the space enables and legitimates that. And so this isn't just I think just a question about architecture, and I think your slide about the absence in Zuccotti Park make that clear. Would you, any of you, ever sit on one of those so-called public benches and look to the person next to you and say, what is your opinion of Mitt Romney? You wouldn't do it. This space is intimate. And it's something that we mistake, that intimacy is going to create sociability, you know? And frankly, if somebody sat down to me and said, tell me, leaning towards me, tell me about, what are your political views? I'd get up and walk away. Of course you would, because it's too close. So there's a whole play in this discussion about the street, about distance and stimulation, as well as getting closer to other people. And that's about kinds of built forms that aren't simply architectural. They're
I mean, I think I was trying to myself say in the beginning as well that I think people like urban spaces because of the ability to be private there. And that, in fact, suburbia also has often the reverse. It puts you in a community where there are a lot of rules and you're sort of, I think, often not as private, don't as private life. But I would say more than the cafe table, the most isolating thing we've invented is the car, of course, which is what really separates us out. Do we need to take questions now?
Yeah, and you have. Yeah.
So I'll just point, Yes? What? Okay, yes?
Yes. Do I need a microphone for recording purposes or just speak loudly?
Speak loudly.
Yes. Okay. Richard Jordan from Concerned Citizens Speak, president of a citizens organization. Thank you very much. Richard Jordan, president of Concerned Citizens Speak. With a question about transport, perhaps to Stephen, and the use of parking lots. Informal modalities such as Megabus, which uses parking lots, or the street. They have no terminals and therefore can offer a service cheaper than Greyhound. Zipcar, which uses no real no places. You can leave it in certain places. and also the modality of alternate side parking. When you sit in the car and wait for 11 o'clock or whatever time it is, you talk with the same people every other day. It's a modality of opening the space. So what is the future of transport in terms of open space? Thank you.
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that. I will say one thing. Transportation Alternatives, a transportation group, had a wonderful use of parking spaces, in that they encouraged people to put a quarter in the meter and set up chairs and tables and turn it into a living room. And I love that. And they had a day of this around New York City.
Parking day, and in fact in San Francisco it's been institutionalized. You can buy parklets or rent parklets. It's another subject, but it's quite interesting. Yeah, do you have one more? We realize we're way over time, my fault, so we just can take one or two at the most. Yes, please.
Yeah, my question was in part because you're sitting in front of the poster, and I see the title, Presence and Absence in the City, and I think this kind of builds on what your presentation and discussion was getting at, that somehow moving to the city implies diversity, when in fact, especially in the Midwest and Northeast of the United States, social and racial segregation has remained constant for the past few decades. So, yeah, can you address maybe the way that we assume that city means diverse and inclusion, when in fact, the relationship between the urban areas and suburbia in terms of diversity might be reversing?
Well, this is a very good intervention that you make. And we know that, in fact, racial segregation is increasing in the top 20 American cities. My worry is one step beyond that, that simply by doing the things that we know how to do about mixing people up don't have the required effect. If you, in school busing, for instance, if you try and create racial diversity by busing kids in, you don't necessarily get the desire, you don't have the chemical reaction. You just have a mixture. And that's the difficulty in urbanism now. When we use the term diversity, we just assume if you put people in the same place, I do too. Alien bodies. If you put them in the same place, something is going to happen. It's not. They have to share a task together. There are lots of, they have to do something more than be in each other's presence. So a lot of the tools that we have, like the ones I was describing, are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Simply being in a mixed space is not going to deal with problems like segregation. Heavens knows for economic segregation, it's even worse. So these tools we have are bad. Not bad, they're insufficient to the ends of this, and this is why this is a big problem in modernity. You can run a society which is like London, which always celebrates itself. We have 361 languages spoken at last count, but they don't speak them to anybody other than each other. And it's how modernity found its peace, by having this combination of difference and indifference.
If I could just say one tiny thing, and then I realize we're rushed, but I've been thinking about affordable and mixed income housing, and one of the things that everyone who's an advocate for housing points out to me is that mixed income housing is almost always the most successful form of housing. It's exactly what Richard is saying, because putting people together itself is not enough, but forcing people in a certain sense to interact and make decisions together. And those communities tend to be the ones which work, because you cannot simply be with your own people who make the same sort of decisions.
You have to do something with it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've run over, and so forgive us.
We're very gabby.
My fault.